our chair for the session, Professor Saskia Jaszoltowski, who is our visiting professor from Graz. We have an exchange with Graz, and Professor Jaszoltowski will introduce our session on domestic politics. So Saskia, take it away.
Yes, well, thank you very much. I'm so happy to be here, and I'm so happy to share this next session, even though I'm an absolute outsider on more than one behalf, but first and foremost because I'm a musicologist, and yeah, scared, jump scared I was. No, but of course, having said that, the relationships between music and politics are very intimately, right? There are so many important connections to be drawn here, and the 20th century has shown us how important these connections are, of course, between politics and music, and how politics can, of course, influences with anything they do. Politicians do influence the musical life, the musical cultural life, and the way where art is going, where culture is going, and things like that. And in the same way, of course, politics uses music to form a cultural identity, to form collective identities, and that is basically what we're talking about here as well, of course. And but the closest relation between Kreisky and music would be what was mentioned yesterday already, the connection that a Viennese rock band, indie band, is called Kreisky, actually, and they're quite well known in Austria and quite popular in Austria. So, and I was wondering why they were calling themselves Kreisky, and apparently I just googled that very quickly, and apparently it has no political reasons whatsoever. So I don't have to do any research about that anymore. However, of course, music is always, as we know, politically significant. And then they said, well, they called themselves Kreisky because it sounded as if something Großes and Mythisches, something great and mythic about it. That's what they said. And then they also said, well, it is a schöner, kantiger, harter Bandname. So beautiful, hard, and kantig. Kantig, yeah. Band name. So that's about it. I have to say to Kreisky, right? But I think this ambiguity maybe mirrors a little bit as well the character, as I have done today, of Kreisky. So the ambiguity of something beautiful and something kantig. So that is not always going along together. So I guess, and I'm very excited to introduce now our speakers here. So our first speaker will be Matthew Berg, who is Professor of History at the Department of the University Professor of History at the John Carroll University, and he earned his PhD from the University of Chicago. His research is located in the field of post-war reconstruction and the experience of occupation, and he is especially concerned with the political course in Austria after the Second World War. And besides having earned various Fulbright scholarships and stipends and other fellowships, he will talk today about Kreisky and the Socialist Party, and which will be very interesting. And kind of in tandem towards this, our next speaker then, Günter Bischof, we'll talk about Kreisky and the Marshall Plan, and I think both speakers are very well equipped for speaking about their topic. Günter Bischof is Professor of History, or to be more precise, the University Research and Marshall Plan Professor of History at the University of New Orleans. He earned his PhD from Harvard University, and his research focuses mainly on the history of the diplomatic politics between the United States and Europe, especially on the foreign politics and identity, again, here, of course, Austria, and Austria's role in the Cold War era. So I should also mention several positions as a visiting professor at universities of Innsbruck, Munich, Vienna, Prague, Moscow, and Jerusalem. So I'm very excited to listen to both of your talks, and I would give the stage to Matthew as our first speaker.
Thank you, Saskia. When I started working on this paper in February, knowing who was going to be here, I thought to myself, what new perspectives can I offer? And after all of us keynote yesterday and the early morning, the first morning panel, I feel myself thinking that all the more. And I find myself really wondering what I'd feel if I was up later in the day. But I sail forth. So what new perspectives can one offer on the relationship between Kreisky and the Austrian Socialist Party, particularly from his emergence as Parteivorsitzender through his period as Bundeskanzler, or the way the Socialist Party positioned itself in Austria's domestic and international politics from the late 1960s into the early 1980s, or on Kreisky's self-understanding as an Austrian, as a European, and as a global citizen. And you'll forgive me the omission that I didn't touch on your terrain. Abundant scholarship addressing these questions has established appropriate benchmarks for empirical inquiry and critical evaluation, including, of course, contributions from people in the room. What I propose to do is to speak on the question of cohesiveness within the social democratic milieu prior to 1934, and then after 1945, to identify ways in which Kreisky's personal experience, as he reported it in the memoirs, and I'll say more about that in a minute, aligns with that milieu, and to explore how the Socialist Party's elevation to sole governing party at the federal level marked a political triumph and also ushered in a new set of challenges to that very milieu. A few words of clarification are required before I proceed any further. My work looks at reconstruction of the social democratic milieu in Vienna from a rank and file perspective. And I've drawn very extensively on Pierre Bourdieu's notion of the habitus, and I'll do so here again. And we might understand this term, many of you are familiar with it, I expect. We might understand this term broadly as a set of attitudinal dispositions common to members of a social unit, whether they're a professional group, a religious community, a political party, even family, and so on. This suggests a degree of close self-identification with the group and confirmation of one's belonging within that group via affiliation and adherence to norms and values. In short, a reciprocal process that promotes and sustains sociality. The arc of Kreisky's life experiences encompass transitions, as we well know, from monarchy to troubled republic, from indigenous fascism to National Socialism, and to then a republic that enjoyed increasingly greater support. Austrian social democracy as a political party that represented related interests evolved concomitantly. So drawing on period-specific examples from Kreisky's memoirs and informed by secondary literature, I suggest that Kreisky's self-understanding was consistent with the social democratic habitus, even if his path to it was not the norm for many of the party faithful. So just a word on memoir literature. As we know, that can be problematic. One has to find a way to thread the needle between candid depictions of one's best recollections of one's feelings and attitudes at a specific time at a great distance, or self-congratulation. It's not easy. And in that respect, diaries might be a more interesting source where they're available because they're more immediate. You know, people are writing them the day of an event, the reflections on something. But what we have here are the memoirs. And we also have some biographies. I mentioned to Wolfgang Petrich yesterday, and I wanted to say here that I ordered his biography in February with every intention of working with it, you know, in the stages of preparing this paper, but due to the difficulties of my library's interlibrary loan system, I'm still waiting for it. So when I revise this paper, I will have it at the ready. So I relied on Pierre Secher's English language biography from, I believe it was a half dozen years earlier.
You'll get the copy.
Thank you.
Oh.
I will hold you to that. Thank you. So I'll conclude my comments then, and I realize I'm running, the time is running. I'll conclude my comments with some thoughts about how the evolution of the Socialist Party towards a center-left party with broad appeal by the 1970s brought both electoral success and the opportunity to implement significant policy changes, many of which you heard referred to by Oliver last night. And yet, I suggest that for the historian and for the political scientist too, it's also significant that when we consider the party as a social unit, these developments coincided with generational shifts and changing patterns of identification in the 1960s and especially in the 1970s that transformed the habitus in ways that could not have been anticipated just a generation earlier. It didn't go away, but it changed. We'll talk more about that. So Kreisky's own path into the Social Democratic Lager is familiar to you. He detailed it in with great care in the memoirs. We know that his parents weren't social democrats. We know his origins were bourgeois and rather comfortable. But his father spoke, as he recalled, with great empathy of the plight of the impoverished and struggling working class communities of Vienna. As Kreisky recalled, his growing awareness of social differences between school comrades, the pressure and abuse to which pupils could be subjected by their teachers, and ultimately the way authorities crushed protests at the Justizpalast in 1927 drove him almost inexorably toward social democratic politics. First to the Vereinigung Sozialistischer Mittelschüler, then to the Sozialistische Arbeiterjugend. Willy Brandt's words from the mid-1980s also rang true about Kreisky in his former years. His concern for vulnerable human beings, the struggle to dismantle injustices, the linkage between freedom and solidarity stand, Brandt wrote, at the center of his motivation. Yet any social democrat who sought any sort of role in the party or one of its auxiliary organizations before 1934, and again immediately after the fall of the Nazis, had to demonstrate her or his bona fides. Suspicion against those with bourgeois intellectual backgrounds, some of them also Jewish, presented obstacles to those easily deterred. Kreisky persevered and slowly won respect first among the Mittelschüler, later with the Arbeiterjugend before 34. He gradually found support among new friends that included both established party figures. I think of Otto Bauer, for instance, the conversations they had, and then members of his peer group who would become prominent after 1945. Moreover, both the result of his opposition to Austrian communists and his arrest by the Fatherland Front, and subsequently by the Nazi regime, his credentials as a faithful social democrat could not be contested. The 1930s proved pivotal in his political coming of age. So, I think I'll skip over that in the interest of time. On to exile. Kreisky's time in Swedish exile was no less formative than his period as a youth education official, an activist, and as a political prisoner of successive fascist regimes. He was fortunate to escape post-Anschluss Austria with only violent Gestapo interrogation sessions. During periods in custody under both regimes, he remained true to his political principles. Similarly, once outside the Reich, he cultivated his connections not only with Austrian social democratic exiles, but also with German and other European comrades, rather than seek an easier path in Stockholm's private commercial sector. These networks, combined with his work as a journalist, led to a keen appreciation for international relations, a field that would later become his post-war specialty. This was his milieu. It reflected how social democracy had become habitus for him. He manifested this work as a journalist. Think of his engagement as a delegate to the International Socialist Youth Conference in Lille just prior to the outbreak of the war, his learning experience working for the Swedish cooperative movement, and his engagement with the Swedish government that earned Austrian deserters from the Wehrmacht, who wound up in Sweden the status of military refugees, as opposed to the designation of deserters from the Wehrmacht. So again, an Austrian and a social democrat in his self-understanding, the way he portrayed himself. When the war ended, he could have simply remained in Sweden and made a comfortable life for himself, but he yearned to return to Vienna, as we've discussed. One might argue that even then he harbored larger political ambitions, having earned respect among Austrian and other international exiles through his tireless engagement on behalf of those who opposed fascism. Well, perhaps there's truth in such a conclusion that he already harbored larger political ambitions. If so, we might counter that such ambition did not run counter to his commitment to social democratic goals, which had been reinforced by his experience in Sweden's functioning democracy. His work with the cooperative movement and interactions with those engaged in the civil, often collaborative give and take of Swedish politics, arguably allowed him to realize the merits of consociational democracy and what would later become Austria's Sozialpartnerschaft, even before the party comrades and erstwhile political opponents crafted the narrative of the ostensibly galvanizing experience of the Lagerstrasse. Moreover, in his capacity as an advisor to the Swedish cooperative movement, he cultivated an understanding of new possibilities in economic organization that would inform his perspectives in the later 1960s, well into the 1980s. If he considered his time in prison in 1935-36 as an invaluable learning experience, a kind of complementary track to his then recently completed university study in law, arguably, Kreisky's time in exile and later as an official in the Austrian representation in Sweden could be looked at as his period of graduate study in political life, right? But we know he wanted very desperately to return, and that happened in May of 46. Kreisky was an Austrian first and foremost. In his recollections, he felt a profound need to be on the spot for the reconstruction of the party and for the Second Republic's foundations. Undoubtedly, there existed among Social Democrats, including both officials and rank and file members who'd been incarcerated or otherwise repressed by the Nazis, an undercurrent of resentment or dismissiveness towards exiled comrades who returned after the war and who sought to contribute to the party's efforts to local, regional, or federal levels. Many returnees lost credibility with some of these party comrades, we know that, because they'd not endured Nazi oppression. In some instances, this sentiment was inseparable from anti-Semitism when returnees came from Jewish backgrounds, even when they did not identify as Jews primarily, or even at all, but as Austrians and Social Democrats. So I'm thinking not only of Kreisky, but of Oskar Helmer, Julius Deutsch, and others. Despite the presence of those attitudes, exiles like Kreisky found themselves, for the most part, reaccepted. Welcomed might be too strong a word, but reaccepted into the milieu. Their efforts might not have uniformly been seen as a contribution to opposition to fascism, but those in the know couldn't discount them. These attitudes, their behavior, their attributes, always subject to verification, whether in the case of exiles who returned, or people who endured fascism while in the country, was all about reestablishing or establishing your bona fides, right? And Kreisky's own lived experience manifested his qualities beyond any doubt, not without controversy, because of his revolutionary socialist sympathies. Party leaders tended to recognize him as a party comrade who contributed ongoing service from abroad. And in his memoirs, he suggests that that was recognized and that he had the right as a returnee to address the party executive committee and the club of the Socialist Party parliamentary deputies on circumstances in Sweden, as well as any additional matters that could be of significance to Austria. I don't know exactly what he meant by a right. I don't think that there was a bylaw to that effect, but there was an understanding that in coming back, he could hold that talk. The fact that Kreisky's self-awareness that he was both able and reliable led him to understand and even expect that the party would and should take care of him. The following recollection from the second volume of his memoirs represents the nature of party patronage networks quite vividly. And here's a quote from him. As I sat in the waiting room of the Parteivorstand, an old and distinguished Vienna municipal official came by and said, "Ah, Comrade Kreisky, well, how are you doing? Would you like to become director of the municipal slaughterhouse?" He said that with a bit of irony, of course, but he hit the nail on the head, for everything was there for the asking those days, every position. Right? Patronage networks in Vienna, at least. As we know, this visit, which Kreisky hoped would result in a return to work in the Viennese party organization, in a capacity commensurate with his understanding of his skills and his experiences, did not produce the outcome he expected. Right? We know, and Oliver mentioned this yesterday, that Renner and Scherf argued that he could serve the party better while abroad. And I wouldn't contest the point Oliver made that his revolutionary socialist background or affiliations had something to do with it. And one could not discount that anti-Semitism may have had some role there too. But I don't think it's an either or conclusion or argument that we should make. Rather, I think it's a both and. Those sentiments may have been present. When he was sent off to be special attaché in Stockholm, you might say, well, what's Stockholm? It wasn't Paris, it wasn't London, it wasn't Washington. But I would argue that Sweden remained unscarred by the war. Sweden had demonstrated the capacity for a functioning democracy and for economic innovation that helped it weather the Depression in reasonably good order, despite the fact that the war made the Depression worse in some places, at least early on. So I would suggest that sending him to Sweden might have been a convenient way to get him out of Vienna, but in putting him there, he could lend a service. And then we might connect, a discussion with the point made earlier about his relationship to aristocratic ambassadors. My understanding is this ambassador was rather ineffectual, sort of a stuffed shirt, and this was an opportunity for somebody who the party leadership trusted to help rebuild Austria's profile in subtle and meaningful ways while there, right? So we've already seen how he was invited back in 1951 and became a special assistant to Kerner. We already have talked about how in 1953 he was able to slide in with the support of Scherf into the state secretary position in the foreign ministry. The argument I would make about these things is an initial realization that this man could be useful, culminating in understanding that there was talent and that they would look after one of their own. Yes, there was horse trading involved in getting a red state secretary into a black ministry, that for certain, but there could have been other people. There could have been other people, right? So I think that this became a key point. This would have been his postdoc in political life. All the way through the state treaty negotiations, we know how instrumental he was in sort of advancing the argument of a Swedish or Swiss style neutrality with an Austrian spin on it. I don't need to go into that. Culminating in his ultimately into his appointment as foreign minister. But the thing that I think is important that we realize is in the eyes of the party, he had been a darling. He hadn't earned anything in the conventional way through Basisarbeit, right? He'd never been elected, right? It had been a long time since he had done Basisarbeit, since the earlier 30s. So he was kind of an expert and a technocrat, very much like the cohort of 1400 who he convened later when he was running the party's successful bid for the 1970 chancellorship. I think he saw a lot of those people in what he had become himself. So I think as a way of rounding this off, let's move into the chancellorship in the 1970s. And we know we all know that he was very successful in expanding the appeal. Without expanding the appeal of the voting public, the party couldn't have won decisive majorities given the peculiarities, idiosyncrasies of the structural idiosyncrasies of the electoral system. So the irony that I would suggest to you as I draw my comments to a conclusion, how much time do I have?
Yeah, it would be good, the conclusion.
Yeah, okay. So in conclusion, what I would suggest to you is the very success that we see in attracting new voters who began to enjoy the success of the economic miracle of the 1960s, which, interestingly enough, was closely temporally positioned to the student movement, right? So many of the people who benefited from the economic miracle, the latter part of that generation were, or maybe a younger part of that generation were also people who could have been very active in the student movement and very critical of the existing party structures as they existed. You saw the emergence of more people understanding their relationship to the party, to a party, as less one of habitus, less of one of sociality, less of the norms that bind people together through shared experience and shared values, and more of a menu of options. What was it that people increasingly became interested in? It's more the modern political phenomenon. Are you a one-issue voter? Is it education? Is it the economy? Maybe two issues. Are you interested in the environment? These things became more and more of a sort of menu of options for voters during the 1970s. And as the political scientist Peter Uram argued, from the mid-1990s perspective, the social liberal consensus that Kreisky forged during his chancellorship, its component groups were drifting apart by the later 70s, if not finding themselves in open conflict with one another. The formerly extensive consensus on aims and methods withered away. So the very success of bringing in more voters, because of generational shifts, also brought challenges to the self-understanding of what it meant to be a social democrat. So my final word would be, what are we to conclude then about Kreisky's relationship to Austrian social democracy and SPÖ's relationship to Kreisky? I've tried to underscore in a few snapshots how his life from the time he became politically active was situated within the habitus as he moved from outsider to committed activist, from political prisoner to exile, from patient lieutenant in service of the party and country to the face and motive force of the party and then of the country as Bundeskanzler. The success he achieved for the party was structured by the internalization of party norms that included creative, thoughtful problem solving on the part of disciplined and committed functionaries. He was a product of the intimate connection between party and constituency that had become consequential after 1919, but which had been evident a generation earlier than that. So he led the Socialist Party to its greatest triumph by something of a relaxation of the internalized gatekeeping that I would say the habitus required, in quotation marks, of loyalists. Since the 1970s, for more and more people, but certainly not at all, politics became the kind of voting that in 2023, we see exploding in a really banal way of voting by liking something, right? It wasn't that in the 1960s and 1970s, but we see the beginning of a turn more towards individualism, more towards less of a sense of identity with party organization. I'm not saying that's a negative thing. I don't blame Kreisky for it. It was not his fault that there were these generational shifts. But in the process of building a coalition that could hold power and institute meaningful reforms in the economy, in education, and in so many other sectors in domestic politics, the result by the mid-late 1990s, when the Social Democrats were still, the majority governing party, was a party that Kreisky would not have been able to recognize quite the same way as he would have seen it as his star was ascending in domestic politics in the later 60s and certainly through the 70s. So that's the irony I want to leave you with.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that talk, and we will switch over to Günter and his talk of the microphone.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for being here. I wanted to start out by thanking the organizers, particularly Howard Luthen and Maya Weinschul, for their hard work in making this possible. And of course, the Austrian ministry, as you well know, who funds our endeavors, is very interested in us working together. So I'm very happy that this came about this way. And I also wanted to thank the Bootstrieber Foundation. Michael Burry worked with us in putting the program together. Kevin McNamara is here from the Bootstrieber Foundation, which has, of course, come to play a very important role in funding these types of Austrian-American events. So we are very pleased about that. Let me also make a couple general remarks. I'm sort of thrilled about the generational exchange, the generational change we have been witnessing this morning. I'm not sure how Ambassador Petric thinks about it. I mean, we heard the grand old guns of Kreisky studies, Radkolb last night. We'll hear Ambassador Petric tonight. But I'm very pleased that we have a young generation of Kreisky scholars. I think that enriches the field immeasurably. And you heard this morning, two of them. We'll hear another one this afternoon. And what's impressive is, you know, Daniel didn't tell us that he works with a lot of Hebrew sources in his book and his dissertation. And of course, Anna did mention she works with a lot of Russian sources, or also Bulgarian sources we saw in the answer period. So I think that's very, very pleasing for Kreisky scholarship overall. And the final point, you know, Oliver Rakob yesterday talked about how Kreisky was a people's man, not a populist, but a man of the people. And I experienced that myself. Let me give you my experience with Kreisky personally. When I was a student at the University of Innsbruck, I was very active in the AFS organization. The AFS being the American Field Service, through which I spent a year in the United States after the matura, after my high school degree in California. And that sort of shaped me as an Americanist to an immeasurable degree. Now, the AFS people from all over Austria would come together in Zug by Lech for a skiing week over Christmas. And you all know, probably, certainly Wolfgang knows, that Kreisky every Christmas went skiing to Lech too. He loved skiing up there. So this is the cradle of skiing. And I grew up nearby on the other side of the mountains. So it was very pleasing to be with my colleagues skiing in this beautiful area. But the interesting thing is we invited Kreisky, who always lived in the Post Hotel, the fanciest hotel, and we lived in the very puny little Zen house in Zug, you know, cheaply, cooking for ourselves. But we invited him to come to the Zen house in Zug, and he came. And imagine this, the chancellor spent an entire evening talking with a group of students about the Austrian foreign policy and global politics. I mean, these were all smart young people who were very interested in the world. They had been AFSers in the United States. So that's the kind of man he was. And the second time I heard him give a speech in Feldkirch, nearby where I grew up in Vorarlberg, and it was, I think, the Arbeiterkammer who organized the speech, and he talked probably for 3 hours on a Saturday evening. That's the kind of man he also was. So, by the way, I also wanted to thank Howard for the excellent meal last night. As we say in German, Liebe geht durch den Magen. He learned what we learned in New Orleans too, is that a good conference geht auch durch den Magen. So that's an important lesson to learn as a conference organizer, that most people remember conferences through the kind of treatment that you receive by your hosts. So anyway, thank you for that. Let me get to my paper. I'm talking about Kreisky and the Marshall Plan, and particularly the culmination that he suggested a sort of Marshall Plan for the Third World at the summit meeting in Cancun. So that's what I'll talk about. Bruno Kreisky explained in his memoirs why he advocated for a Marshall Plan for the Third World. And he gave 4 reasons. First, he hoped to get the United States interested. Secondly, he was hoping for a stronger European engagement in such global ideas. Thirdly, he thought certain accounting modalities utilized in the Marshall Plan would be transferable to the developing world. And fourthly, he felt that while bilateral aid as practiced by the Scandinavian countries was badly needed, but in and of itself was not capable of financing large modernization projects as he envisioned for the Third World. So the way I'm going to go about this is I'm going to engage Kreisky's idea for a Marshall Plan. And then I'm also going to look at what people think whether a Marshall Plan is transferable, and generally speaking, people think it's not transferable. And then the end, I will talk, and probably I won't have time for it, but then you can ask me questions about it, a Marshall Plan for the Ukraine, to bring it up to the current level and sort of come back to the question that our political scientist asked Anna this morning. Okay, that's I'm going to go to proceed. So now we've heard from both Oliver and Matthew a lot about Kreisky's early career. I was about to talk about that too. He returned from a Swedish exile to Vienna, and then of course went back to Sweden. But then interestingly, he came back and he worked in the Wirtschaftspolitische Abteilung of the Foreign Ministry. The Foreign Ministry, which was at that time still in the Federal Chancellery located. So this division of economic affairs obviously also had to deal with Marshall Plan matters. And my suspicion is, I haven't looked it up in the archives yet, that Kreisky worked closely with the young Marshall Plan official Hans Igler, who was later the president of the industrial organization in Austria, because Igler worked in the Zentralbüro des ERP-Programmes. This is the central office of the Marshall Plan, also in the Federal Chancellery. So I suspect that there he learned a lot about the details of how the Marshall Plan actually worked. So then he began, of course, his ascent as a socialist. We heard a lot about that too in previous papers, so I'm not going to talk about that either. So became state secretary. And we should not forget that this is the time when Stalin had died in March of 1953, and when there was new possibilities about dealing with the Soviet Union. And actually the Raab government, and of course Kreisky included, recognized that and initiated a more friendly policy vis-a-vis the Kremlin. And even though they didn't get a state treaty in the Berlin Council of Foreign Ministers in 1954, by 1955, Khrushchev was emerging as the premier figure in the Politburo, and it was Khrushchev who sort of forced Molotov, the foreign minister who had blocked the Austrian state treaty for 8 years, to finally give in and begin negotiating with the Austrians. And Kreisky indeed played a very important role in shaping the SPÖ policy towards the state treaty, and after that in shaping Austria's neutrality policy. Again, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail there. But let me tell you that in 1959, we heard he became foreign minister. He became a separate foreign ministry. And if you read Kreisky's speeches, and there is 2 thick volumes of Kreisky Reden, published, I think, as a gift to the chancellor by the party. 70th birthday, okay, I forgot the occasion, but if you read those volumes carefully, the Marshall Plan comes up all the time. And in my paper, I have many quotes from those Reden, from the speeches, that I'm not gonna go into in great detail, but essentially, I've mined his speeches towards particularly of the early 60s, particularly towards the issue of the Marshall Plan. And he praised the Marshall Plan again and again and gave credit to the Americans for this insightful program and for essentially helping rebuild Austria. So this is what he wanted to apply to the Third World, because at the same time, during those years, he also wanted to increase development aid by Austria. And he suggested 1% of GNP should go towards development aid. However, Austria never really reached that level. It was sort of somewhere around 0.0, 0.1, 0.8, 0.9. I think the highest it ever was 0.38%. And the eventual international standard that the UN suggested and that Willy Brandt suggested was 0.07% of Western GNP should go towards the third world. So if you will, this was also a foreign aid issue that Kreisky picked up, and he obviously surveyed the field of foreign aid very well and thought the Marshall Plan was the program for modernizing continents like Africa and so forth, and kept plugging it in many speeches he gave across the United States at the Dallas World Affairs Council, at Yale University, many prominent speeches he gave, and always the Marshall Plan comes up. And lo and behold, I thought that was it. But when he was chancellor, of course, and this is due to Howard sending us the newsletter of the Alumni Association where Kreisky's speech is reprinted. When he came here to give the gift of $1 million, and Lonnie is going to talk in greater detail about this this afternoon, he also mentioned Austrian gratitude for the Marshall Plan. Now that I didn't realize happened, but I think it's well worth it for the setter to keep that in mind, that Kreisky was a big advocate of the Marshall Plan from the 60s and still in the 70s, and that's sort of behind the idea of the Austrian bicentennial gift to an American university, which then was chosen to be to the University of Minnesota, and Lonnie is going to explain to us how that came about. Okay, let me then come to the Cancun summit, which happened on October 22nd, 23rd. And again, there was a lot of international organizations, including the UN, who were talking about international economic cooperation in these years. And the crucial stepping stone towards Cancun was that Robert McNamara, who was then the head of the World Bank, suggested that the Brandt Commission, headed by Willy Brandt, the former German chancellor, that they do something for the North-South dialogue, so very generally put. And Brandt picked this up with his commission, was called the Commission on International Development Issues. And they issued a report in December 1979 calling for a North-South summit meeting of select leaders of state. And this is where Bruno Kreisky comes in. They, of course, all you know, they were good friends. And Brandt then approached Bruno Kreisky, would you help me put such a meeting together? And of course, Brandt knew that Kreisky had been interested in this for a very long time. Kreisky initially was skeptical about such a summit meeting, not knowing whether the great powers would participate. So again, think of those first 4 points that he made. To him, it was important that the Americans participate. So there was a number of preparatory meetings at Castle Klesheim in Salzburg, and then again in Vienna, diplomatic meetings, and Anna talked about the diplomatic process too, which of course he was very knowledgeable about, but I think which he didn't really think was that great. So he wanted a quick meeting, not with large preparation and with few people being invited. So he was thinking very intensely about the process of how this meeting could come about, and didn't like the fact that there was diplomatic conferences that sort of were thinking for a long time, how could we put this meeting together? So then the invitations were issued for Cancun for October 1981, and the Mexican President López Portillo was a co-sponsor with Kreisky of such a meeting, and López Portillo, of course, chose Cancun because it's in Mexico, in the Yucatan Peninsula, you all know. And then the interesting thing is who came. Reagan came, Thatcher came, Mitterrand came. The Russians didn't come, the Chinese came. Kreisky didn't go because he fell sick. He had a pneumonia at the time. And Helmut Schmidt didn't come either because he was sick at the time. And then Pierre Elliott Trudeau, the Canadian Prime Minister, jumped into the fray for Kreisky and co-hosted the meeting. So then the meeting met in October. suggesting a Marshall Plan for the third world, but the Austrian proposition is that over, I think, 15 years, some $200 million should be spent for modernizing the third world, particularly Africa. But nobody was interested in such sums at the time. Reagan definitely wasn't, because Reagan thought aid should come from private corporations and not through big state-funded programs. So in that sense, Reagan was not a believer in the Marshall Plan either. But again, for you all to remember, is the Marshall Plan idea had sat so long in Kreisky's head from the 60s to the 70s that now he suggested such a big program. However, he wasn't in Cancun and could fight for it. So scholars who have looked at this, including Oliver Rakolb, and have written on it, they sort of agree with the Sunday Times that Cancun was a charade. They called it the Cancun charade because nothing much happened. Now imagine, that's what the critics said. All these statesmen sitting in Cancun, if they wanted to study the third world, they just needed to go into the favelas outside of the big hotels in Cancun, and they could have studied poverty and what could be done. So in that sense, I think there was an ambiguity too that Kreisky would not have appreciated very much, but Kreisky wasn't there. So I think one of the intriguing questions is, had Kreisky been there and had been advocating this big third world aid program, would it have worked? And I think I'll leave that open. It might have worked. But let me just, on the issue of, is a Marshall Plan possible to be transferred to other areas, mention an issue in Foreign Affairs magazine for the 50th anniversary of the Marshall Plan, where Helmut Schmidt, the German chancellor, now of course no longer in office, argued Marshall aid was successful because Europe possessed a long-standing entrepreneurial heritage, a base business acumen, a high level of general education and technological knowledge, as well as engineering capacities. And he came to the conclusion, no Marshall Plan can succeed where such prerequisites do not exist. With regard to Russia, for which a Marshall Plan was advocated after the end of the Cold War, Schmidt said a large-scale Marshall Plan for Russia would probably fail because many years must pass before Russia will generate the entrepreneurial skills and develop the personal experience in decision-making among managers and employees. And his brutal conclusion was about aid, he called it a basic truth. Aid will be successful only where the possibility of self-help exists or can be revived. Otherwise, these efforts will be limited to mere charity. So with that in mind, of course, a lot of scholars think similarly that the Marshall Plan cannot be transferred, even though it's often advocated for transfer in big reconstruction cases. I'm not surprised at all that it's coming up all the time with regard to Ukraine. But since my time is up, I'm not going to talk about Ukraine. I think probably they would have the entrepreneurial skills for a Marshall Plan, but that is, of course, is the big open question. So with that being said, I'd like to thank you all for your attention, and maybe we can discuss Ukraine in the conclusion.
Yeah, thank you so much, Günter, for this interesting talk, and Matthew, as well for your talk. That gives us yet another side of how Kreisky not only shaped the domestic politics, but also, of course, influenced the worldwide politics. So that is very interesting. Yeah.
So you want to come out, Matthew? Like this morning, yeah. Well, both are available for questions.
Yeah, thank you. I have a question for you, Günter, about the the intentions behind it. Was this intention to do in the third world, in Africa, and these developing places? The reason was pure like humanitarian aid for it, or trying to really have serious impact and bring political influence in these places, like what China is trying to do now in Africa? Was that the seer, or trying to help for the sake of humanity?
My sense is it was more the humanitarian impulse that drove Kreisky in terms of a Marshall Plan for the third world. I mean, he definitely didn't think the way China thinks about giving aid to Africa. Well, one day we can bring him geopolitically on our side. I don't think that was, I mean, it was considered, you know, remember this was the age of development when a lot of talk in US foreign affairs was about And a lot of criticism of American foreign policy, particularly from Latin America, was about, their development policy. That doesn't work. So Kreisky thought, many of the mechanisms of the Marshall Plan, which I haven't really had time to go into, like drawing rights being used for European trade reconstitution, or the counterpart funds that were generated out of the Marshall Plan for investment, that those kinds of mechanisms would work in the third world towards modernization too. So I don't think it's a good question, but my sense is it's not going into direction how the Chinese think about aid.
Just one question to Günter regarding the Marshall Plan. I think what is very important, in my opinion, that the Marshall Plan with its setup triggered the multilateralism being incorporated into European politics, Western European politics. It was an office in Paris, which then became eventually the OECD, the macroeconomic coordination of the industrialized countries, the member states. And I think this is also what Kreisky was very fond of, and he did very important. What is your?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's all over his speeches if you read them, meaning not so much multilateralism, but European integration.
Yeah.
And it's clear that Kreisky, and I think this goes back to his time in the Wirtschaftspolitische Abteilung of the Foreign Ministry, that Kreisky was very well aware that the United States had essentially been the godfather of European integration through the Marshall Plan, because if you think about it, in this office in Paris that Averell Harriman headed, Europeans, the French, the Germans for the first time sat together in order to sort of sort out which country would get how much aid. So in that sense, many of the European integrationists were involved with the Marshall Plan. Jean Monnet himself was in the early stages. And that's where they learned the business of becoming Europeans and overcoming their national perspectives. So in that sense, I mean, you're right, call it multilateralism. Usually he called it European integration. Yeah.
Of European unification.
Yeah, because if you think about the stages, there is the Marshall Plan, there is the coal and steel community, then comes the EEC communities, and that's how things progressed. But the Marshall Plan is at the beginning.
Matt, I wanted to ask you about Bruno Kreisky as a revolutionary socialist, Austro-Marxist, and then the transformation to being an Austrian patriot, simply because there was a very, very strong pan-German Großdeutsche tradition in Austrian Austro-Marxism. And actually, one of the Otto Bauer wrote about the Gesamtdeutsche Revolution. We're going to defeat fascism and maintain the Anschluss after the victory. Where did Kreisky stand on this? Because the Anschluss was sort of a necessary prerequisite for the development of the modern Austrian national identity. They had to get that experiment over with, right?
Yeah. It turned out to be a negative catalyst in that direction, of course. Let me say first, I'm more than willing and ready to defer to people who can speak to this more closely than me. We know that he had a sort of pupil-tutor relationship with Otto Bauer. They saw each other from time to time, including when Bauer was in exile before he died. I'm not aware, and again, I'm happy to be corrected, that there was any indication in any of Kreisky's own writings that he ever leaned towards the Anschluss, ever. Right. And I speculate that that may have been from his sense of his family's deep connection in a monarchy that had its own sense of identity. I think as Bauer was Jewish too, so it's interesting that he was willing to accept that fatalistically, that the Anschluss fatalistically to some extent. I don't think that Kreisky ever drank that Kool-Aid.
I hope I didn't sleep through it. I haven't heard any mention so far of Kreisky's interest in the coalition of non-aligned nations and any connection to Nehru or the Bandung Conference. And I know I lived through this, and I thought that Kreisky was involved. It's a long time since I heard anything about this, not my specialty. But none of you has addressed that as a dimension of his vision of the international world order. And it would seem to me it fits nicely in his habitus as an international social democrat and his commitment to third world development and his seeing the virtues of non-alignment, of neutrality. So isn't there a fit here that should have been?
Yeah, no, I think I have a bit of it in my paper, but I think one of the premier Kreisky scholars who's not with us because she couldn't come is Elisabeth Röhrlich, but she sent us Christoph Beitel, and she talks about those things too. And I mentioned, you know, that the Wiener Institute for Entwicklungsfragen, which Ambassador Petric mentioned, is sort of the crucial interlink there. And Kreisky's friendship with Nehru led towards the Indians supporting that institute. He was pretty good at raising funds for those kinds of initiatives. Nehru and various German, I think, foundations paid for it. That's how he sort of established a platform for his quote unquote third world policies, which of course was in the interest of non-alignment too. And I think Vienna, Austria was never officially a non-aligned nation. As a neutral, they couldn't be, but I think they attended some of the summits, like the ones put together in Yugoslavia and Egypt. Remember, this comes out of the Bandung conference. So
Austria is still an observer at the non-aligned meetings, which are now happening very infrequently.
Right.
But at the time, they were very active. Peter Jankovic was the one who actually took care on behalf of Kreisky.
Well, prior to the Cancun meeting, the non-aligned meeting was in Cuba. And they wanted to sort of propose such initiatives too that Kreisky had in mind for Cancun. But since Cuba was Cuba, they realized the Americans wouldn't like that at all, you know, that Cuba. So Cuba's involvement with non-alignment didn't help the movement in that sense.
But I think the interesting point to Gary's question is the hook back to your slide about Kreisky's statement that social democracy was in a position to promote peace from a kind of leadership position in the CSCE process, right? So I think that's where the two concepts come together. No.
I think we have two last questions, maybe. Yes, Anna and then I have a question for Günter. So I see a bit of an irony in the fact that Kreisky was always an advocate for having conferences on the highest level and not like those diplomatic conferences, but then he couldn't go to Cancun. So was there ever the thought of sending a deputy, or was it not possible, or why did you go to Cancun?
A good question. I think the foreign minister was there, and there was an appointment. Ambassador Link was Kreisky's appointment, and he wrote a long paper which informed part of what I was saying about the Cancun process and the diplomatic run-up to it. And he writes probably about the fact that he didn't want to have a diplomatic meeting, but a high-level meeting. So that's sort of a point, I think, that I take from your paper and from my paper, that he was very interested in the diplomatic process of arranging such meetings. Yeah.
Maybe if I may add, Kreisky was very interested in having top-level meetings, but in a relaxed and informal atmosphere. Yeah, I think that was important. In my opinion, in the case of the CSE process, he was mistaken to believe that top could achieve something. I think in the end, for the success of the CSE process, the experts, diplomats, experts were actually crucial. Yeah. In the case of Cancun, my impression is that I was part of it. I was there with Berg, and we actually traveled first to Canada to hand over to Trudeau the chairmanship, the co-chairmanship with Lopez. And the Austrian delegation was led by Foreign Minister Paar.
Yeah.
There you already had a problem. I think we can speak here in camera that actually Georg Lenk, the foreign policy advisor, who actually did the whole work. He was the, he was the one who worked with the secretary, Mr. Lopez, and also with all the contacts. He was much better informed, and he had all the knowledge and the ins and outs that the foreign minister, our government, did not have. And there was actually a conflict because foreign minister said to Lenk, listen, you're not gonna now do the job here. It's me, I'm the foreign minister. And this is highly problematic. What I'm saying now actually led to or contributed to the miserfolg. Yeah. Because there was a meeting with the entourage of Reagan, and in the speech of Reagan, when you read this carefully, you see an opening. Yeah, but nobody except Lenk realized this, and of course Kreisky would have realized it. Lenk could go to the secretary, could go to the president or so, yeah. So, but if Kreisky would have been there was now in retrospect a minimal chance, at least. The Kreisky would say, well, very interesting what you have said here. Well, how can we now move on to the next step? Should we have an informal group that gets, again, coming back to the CSE process is important. You have to first have a substance, you have to have topics, yeah, and then the process, yeah. And so this is, in my opinion, what explains in a way the minimal chance of that was in there, but of course, I mean, this is all counterfactual thinking, yeah.
But I think I would add it to it too, that in the CSE process, there was also a brilliant Austrian diplomat, Liedermann, you mentioned him this morning, who was sort of the link, if you will, of the CSE process. So in other words, there was these brilliant point people from the diplomatic corps that did the heavy lifting. And when Kreisky then misspoke like he did in Moscow, then there was conflict. So essentially, the professional diplomat thought differently from the chancellor. So in that sense, they are comparable, these two.
Because if I may say, I'm sorry, because the ideological aspect of the Cold War was left aside. Yeah? So this was more the technocrats that spoke about the technicalities. Yeah? And in this way, for example, the human dimension in this, which was so crucial then in the destruction of or implosion of the Soviet bloc, nobody at the top level would have agreed to this on the eastern in Moscow. Yeah. So therefore, that in a way, low key. I mean, for me now, that was really a classical and very impressive diplomatic work of experts.
Yeah.
In terms of time, let's have one last question, please.
Yeah. I just had two quick comments. First of all, I find Chancellor Schmidt came as somewhat condescending about the Marshall Plan, because if you look at the Marshall Plan in detail, the first year and a half, it's all about foodstuff, basic energy, and so on. A lot of those countries had very little managerial resources. I think of Greece, which was in the middle of a civil war. And the Marshall Plan has to develop for a year and a half or two in the middle of a civil war. Another thing we forget And this gentleman, I'm sorry, I don't know your name, I apologize.
Not in-
You are talking about multilateralism, I talk about regionalism, it doesn't really matter. But we forget the Marshall Plan was never directed to one country only.
Mhm.
And for example, this union of payment, which is established the second or third years, is incredibly important. It's what relaunches the trade between the countries. So
Yeah.
when we talk about a Marshall Plan for Russia, first, we should have been willing to give foodstuff and so on. B, we should have looked regionally. And actually, I'm writing a book about that. We'll see if it ever appears. But for Ukraine, it should be the same. I consider one of the tragedy of Ukraine, we made the Ukrainian choose between East and West.
Yeah.
If ever there is a Marshall Plan for Ukraine, it has to be regional and not only about Ukraine. Or then it's not a Marshall Plan, and that's fine.
Well, actually,
Yes.
very much agree. And
Yeah.
actually, I wrote a piece on it recently where I actually suggested if there ever is going to be a Marshall Plan, then do it regionally and offer it also to Russia.
Yeah.
You know, of course, they are not
Not
going
now,
to
but-
take it, but I think this kind of openness, this is really the spirit of the Marshall Plan, because the Marshall Plan, Günter, you know, I mean, that was offered to all the Eastern European countries.
And
in fact,
Yugoslavia got funds.
Czechoslovakia was already in Paris and so on, you know, and then, so that this is something, I think these are the lessons from the Marshall Plan for the future, not so much the specifics,
Yeah.
but then the underlying thinking.
If I may jump in and the lessons of the Marshall Plan right now, offering things to all people, we would like to offer all of you, our guests and our participants, lunch. And we have that ready for us one floor below. And we will reconvene here at 2. If for those of you, if the weather cooperates and you want to stretch your legs, you may want to cross the Mississippi and see it raging below and in flood stage safely from a bridge. But we will be back here at 2, and you all are welcome to have lunch with us. One floor below, correct, Meyer? It's in 614, which